Hi, I'm Marg, President and CEO of CFA Institute. Our mission is to lead the investment profession with the highest standards of ethics, education, and professional excellence for the ultimate benefit of society. Here we are at COP26, and of course, there's probably been no more time for the ultimate benefit of society. We have 170,000 members of investment professionals around the globe. Kate, over to you.
Hi, and my name's Kate Hampton. I'm the CEO of Children's Investment Fund Foundation, which is the world's largest philanthropic foundation focused on the well-being of children. And so as part of that mission, we obviously focus on climate change and clean air. And I'm joining you, as you can see from my hotel room in Glasgow. It's day one of the conference. We had a really interesting speech today from the UN Secretary General calling for credibility in the commitments of non-state actors, which includes business and finance. So a great time to be having this conversation, Marg.
Great. Well, I think what we're going to talk a little bit about today is both from a corporate side and from a financial investment professional side and how the two come together. So one of the things I think everybody is pretty interested in, particularly as you've kicked off day one, is what is required to get us to net zero and to drive that capital allocation. We know that there is lots of capital in the world. The world is aflush with capital. And the real imperative right now is to make sure that it's allocated properly, because if it's misallocated, it's a missed opportunity, which of course has great significance for all of us around the world.
Yeah, no, so I mean, of course, I think motivation and skills are both going to be really important. And I'm hoping, Mark, that you're going to speak to the skills piece. In terms of the motivation piece, it's really about, and this is what COP26 is trying to do globally, is creating the right enabling environment for decisions to be taken that are aligned with net zero. So I think in the run up to COP26, you've seen a flurry of commitments from countries and companies focused on net zero by mid-century. But while countries have to come up with near-term plans, most companies haven't done so. So we really need to see much more commitment to making sure that near-term action is aligned with those long-term goals. And that really means every single investment decision, corporate decision being taken through the lens of climate change. So it's not ESG on the side, it's not climate change as a nice to have. It's every decision from now on in the near term aligned with that net zero goal. And corporates have a huge amount of influence on the solutions. A third of emissions come from companies, if you include scope 1 and scope 2 in their own operations. And if you include supply chains, that's almost all the emissions. And somebody's financing those emissions. And so we really do need near-term plans that align capital allocation, as well as things like executive compensation and public affairs with this net zero goal.
I think about it from the investment side of the lens. I think there are really three things. One is, first of all, the risk management of it. I would say that the investment profession is late to the game in some regards, partly because of the challenges that you've just outlined, right? Getting the data, getting the concrete plans with which investment professionals can properly assess those plans, make their decisions both on the financial and non-financial material information that's provided. So when I think about it from where we are right now, of course, there's the opportunity for a Minsky moment, right? That portfolios are materially repriced based on new information, whether that's jurisdictions that are changing the rules, whether that's imperative from investors, or just really a better understanding of the exogenous, the externalities that can impact portfolios quite dramatically. I think our business faces the same challenges that you do, whether it's on the incentives, whether it's on the time horizons, and then whether it's really on the skills, data, and frameworks. So from our perspective, we can see in research that we've recently done that while 7 of 10 investment professionals use ESG in their considerations for portfolio allocation, only about 1 in 10 actually feel really confident in that. And I think that speaks to two things. One is the skills, reskilling and upskilling that's required more broadly of investment professionals. We've launched our ESG certificate. It was developed by practitioners, leading practitioners in the field for practitioners, and it's really to give investment professionals the fundamental skills and technical skills necessary to bridge that gap between the data that's coming out and then how it gets allocated in security and selection and portfolio construction. The other thing we see, of course, is that the data is just all over the map. And so CFA Institute is increasingly using its voice and platform to really have coalescing of the data, pushing corporates for that disclosure on financial and non-financial material information to allow investment professionals to be able to make those decisions, whether it's through TCFD, SASB, IFRS, IIRC. We see these as important entities to drive that really going forward. You talked a little bit at the beginning about credibility and accountability, and I'd love you to expand on that just a little bit more.
Sure, Marg. So, look, companies now need to develop, disclose their plans. This is really important. So near-term plans. So in the disclosure space, for example, we've gone from voluntary disclosure through the CDP platform to mandatory disclosure, which is now being adopted by a number of countries through TCFD. The same is going to happen with plans. At the moment, companies are voluntarily coming forward with some plans to implement their targets, but that will also have to be made mandatory over time as regulators step in to make sure that there is real accountability around this. The problem is we have a lot of company directors who don't really have the skills necessary to hold businesses to account. So a recent study by NYU showed that only 3% of 1,000 plus directors actually had the capability to assess corporate plans, the quality of corporate plans. So this is really, really essential. And the problem is, I don't know if you heard about the code red from scientists this year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We're running out of time. So 2050 is a useful goal, a useful North Star, but it really doesn't mean anything unless we're taking action in the short term. So we have to have annual performance against really near-term targets and make sure that capital is flowing. So credibility essentially means making sure that near-term action is aligned with this long-term goal. And accountability means that ultimately regulators are going to have to step in and provide a really, really clear framework for all of this. And the ultimate provider of accountability is, in fact, the public through civil society demanding action from different stakeholders. So I think we're going to see an increasing amount of pressure on companies and investors to improve the credibility, the near-term delivery of those now stated goals in the run-up to COP26. But we're also going to see regulators starting to step in to make sure that the performance is there and that there are consequences for non-performance. We don't really have time for voluntary anymore. We're moving very much in that direction.
When we think about that accountability and credibility and capital allocation, those three things coming together, we certainly are very concerned about greenwashing, which is, of course, a regulatory concern as well. And that is that the investment products that are designed very much to get capital in the right hands are declaring environmental, social, climate features which may or may not, either intentionally or more likely inadvertently, not really there. So yesterday we launched our ESG disclosure standards for investment products. It's the first of its kind globally. It works in all jurisdictions. It's not in conflict, which is important for investment managers, particularly those big asset managers that are cross-jurisdictional. And it works for different investment vehicles and different investment products. And it really gets at the heart of disclosures for investment managers on the nature and characteristics of those investment funds such that investors can allocate properly. I mean, one of the things that we really saw was that objectives, processes, the stewardship activities were missing from many investment disclosure documents, which meant people really couldn't allocate properly. So we've just released that yesterday, which we think has an important element contribution on the investment management side. What do you hope will come out of COP26? There's been so much momentum around it, so much attention, in a way, frankly, that we really haven't seen. And, the pandemic has probably really helped catalyze a lot of that. As you're there in Glasgow, what do you hope to see come out of this?
Well, I think the real problem is that most financial institutions lack a clear framework for this. So this week, over the next couple of days, you're going to hear lots of people talk about the work that financial institutions are doing, whether it's banks, asset managers, asset owners, the insurance sector, in aligning with net zero. Now, a lot of progress has been made, but there are some gaps in terms of this credibility and accountability that I mentioned. So, for example, the real proof of this is going to be, are those plans aligned with scenarios called low or no overshoot scenarios, where we stay within the carbon budget that scientists have outlined for us. And that really means, as the International Energy Agency has said, getting out of fossil fuels as fast as possible. So that means winding down fossil fuel assets, not making new investments in fossil fuel supply. And of course, investors are going to be invested in a range of businesses. So obviously, divestment and the exclusion of fossil fuels is part of the strategy. For a lot of high-emitting sectors, we're actually going to need high levels of engagement. We're going to need investors that have the skill set to push sectors towards net zero alignment in the near term, really taking hard decisions now. So I wanted to throw the question back to you, actually, in terms of, you mentioned stewardship, and we hear more and more investors talk about stewardship. Do you think we need a new generation of activist investors? How is this going to change investment management, and how is CFA thinking about that?
So I think there's really three different avenues. First of all, I think it's going to be a multi-pronged approach. Exclusionary. I think Hiro Mizuno, when he was leading Japan's pension fund, which was the world's largest, they've got their playbook out there, was basically, we can divest. They had calculated they were at 4% or 4 degrees. They said, we can divest and we'll be successful and the planet will still burn. And I think there's increasingly, the world's leading managers are taking that approach. So even passive managers are taking their stewardship and engagement activities much more seriously. But what it does mean for our industry, after decades of the active versus passive debate, is that there really is a rich opportunity for active management, both to create those really strong returns, mitigate risk, and have an impact. And it's probably been a while since we've seen those kind of returns. The challenge we have, of course, is the data. And in some regards, increasing data from corporates, but without the history of how to use that, creates opportunities for imagination, for proper allocation, and to really get that capital directed effectively to the most to the strongest projects, to the strongest corporations that are out there with the ability to address climate and fossil fuels quickly. Like you, though, it will not be any one actor. It'll be civil society, client demand. It will be the regulators. It'll be government policy, and then the combination of public and private investment. So we're down to our last.
Sorry, Marg. Yeah, I just wanted to bring in emerging markets, because you talk about risk management, and there is a danger that the risk premiums for emerging markets go up with more ESG, and actually 70% of the transition capital needs to flow to low and middle income countries. So investors are going to have to get their heads around blended capital, working with all the kinds of stakeholders that you talked about. Do you think the investment community is ready for that?
I think the investment community is quickly becoming ready, right? Because it does create a risk profile. They still have to create returns. And I often think about a huge sector of our market, which is pension plans. And those pension plans must create returns. They have to manage their risk, and they'll have to find them outside of the normal course of just developed markets. So it will take a multi-pronged approach in different sectors and in different jurisdictions. And of course, that's where I think the real strong asset management skills come into, and active management plays a significant role. It'll no doubt be enhanced or aided by public policy, government, and regulatory requirement. It will not just simply be capital flowing freeform into those spaces. And that's why something like COP26, which has all of the actors and players descending on one place, becomes critically important. It's not just conversations like this, it's the meetings that matter, and the random spontaneous connections that inevitably will lead to many announcements.